past the flood and into the times of the patriarchs. So we'll do that tonight. We'll talk about some of the book divisions up front and help you understand the way your Old Testament is structured versus the way the Old Testament of the Hebrew people was structured during the days of Jesus. Before I do that, though, I have a few announcements. New member orientation is next week during our fellowship meal, which we do have another fellowship meal next week. And so don't forget that. Plan to stay after. We will not have any service next Sunday evening because of the fellowship meal. So we will take a week off, and that actually is perfect timing for me because it gives me time to work on those timelines, and I need a little extra time to get those timelines done so I can give them to you as a whole, so we can get started the week after on the timelines. If you haven't taken new member orientation yet, you need to take new member orientation if you want to be a member of Redemption Road, so I need you to go through that. If you can't make it or you don't want to go through in a group, I will start doing people individually going forward. So you just need to contact the office and make an appointment. It takes about an hour, a little over an hour to do it one-on-one. Just go through and answer any questions you have, explain our expectations, and go through the orientation material with you. But it's really helpful because we wanted to make sure that we got everybody off on the same foot, that everybody knows what we're trying to accomplish, who we actually are, what we believe, how our bylaws are structured, and why they're structured that way. That way it kind of deals with any confusion that might be out there as to what we were doing, especially with the bylaws. And I really want to go through and be able to explain that to people so they can see the wisdom that we were trying to put in place in case anything bad ever happened in the future. So it's really important for everybody to go through that. It's the way in which you become a member here at the church. February 15th, after the morning service, we will share where we are currently and talk about where we're going, basically what comes next. We're going to go through things like the finances, talk about the financial status of Redemption Road, membership, various offices, different things. So we'll go through all those, but mostly we really want to talk about what comes next. Check Facebook and Instagram for closing information in the future, just as a reminder. Don't forget to check those if you're wondering whether or not we're having services. Make sure you check there. First, it should be posted there as soon as we make the decision. So we make the decision, it usually goes on there right away. If you haven't signed up for the text message service where we send out a text message to let you know, or if you didn't get one, we are transitioning the text messages over, the information over. And if we missed you or didn't get your information updated, make sure you contact the office with updated information so that we can make sure you get a text sent to your cell phone to let you know if we're canceling service. And that's all the announcements that I have for now. So let's get started this evening, kind of working our way through an Old Testament survey. So we'll start with Genesis 1:1. We will read some verses tonight, but we won't read a lot of verses. We're mostly going to give you a lot of information tonight. The goal being it will help us to study the Old Testament as a whole more later on. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and that's the foundation of the Old Testament. In fact, the Old Testament was written over time. So not all of the Old Testament was written at once. And some people who are new to studying the Bible don't understand that. But the first 5 books of the Old Testament were actually written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit by Moses. And so a lot of time had went by before the Bible was constructed. And so he goes back, and part of what he's doing as he's guided by the Spirit to write those first 5 books of the Old Testament is he's recording the history all the way back to the very beginning. The beginning that's referenced in Genesis 1:1, of course, is not the beginning of God. It is the beginning of the material universe as we know it. It was the beginning of the heavens and the earth. And then the creation of animal life, plant life, human life follows. And he chronicles all of that in those first 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis, including the fall, how we got into the situation we're in now. But the rest of the Old Testament, such as Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Esther, Malachi, Zechariah, was written over hundreds of years. So it took hundreds of years to compile the rest of the Old Testament. So it was written over time, which makes it a progressive revelation. In fact, all of Scripture is a progressive revelation. The Bible is made up of 66 individual books, as you know, and there were at least 40, if not 42, individual authors that wrote those books. All of them used by God, so God is the primary author, but he used 40-plus different men. What's amazing about that is it's really hard for somebody to say, well, somebody just sat down at a table and dreamed it all up. Now, I could say that about Islam, because guess who wrote all the holy text of Islam? Muhammad. I could say that about Mormonism, because guess who wrote all the sacred text of Mormonism? Joseph Smith. One man. When you talk about the Bible, though, the question is, well, who wrote the Bible? Well, God oversaw the writing, but we have Moses writing the first 5 books. We have David writing a lot of the Psalms, but not all the Psalms. There are other people who wrote Psalms. We have David writing other books. We have Solomon writing books like Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. We have a mixture of authors for the book of Proverbs. There's not just one, there are several authors of the Proverbs. When you get into the New Testament, we have Matthew, an apostle, writing a gospel. We have another person named Luke writing a gospel. We have John, another apostle, writing a gospel. We have Paul writing letters to the churches like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, all though moved by the Spirit of God to write. And the amazing thing about it is, over the hundreds, really almost 1,000 years that it took to write the entirety of Scripture, it all fits together perfectly. Isn't that amazing? So when you do an Old Testament survey, what you see is how well all those different books that make up the Old Testament fit together. And that's what we're going to be looking at, is how well they fit. Going all the way back to the beginning is where we start, the beginning of the material universe, working our way all the way up to the days of Zechariah. Zechariah being the last of the Old Testament prophets. And so that's what we'll survey. We'll survey that period of time between the beginning and Zechariah. So we want to talk about divisions a little bit. So as we do an Old Testament survey, we're going to be looking at the book divisions. In your Old Testament, there are several ways to divide it up. And to help you to understand why it's divided up that way is where we're going to start. And this has been true since the very beginning of the construction of the Old Testament. The Hebrew people had 2 divisions. The earliest division that they made was 2 parts. They called it the law and the prophets. Jesus often used this designation to describe the Old Testament. He would refer to the Old Testament as the books of the law and the books of the prophets. And we see this in a couple different passages, but if you want to do an interesting Bible study, just do a search if you have computer software that allows you to search, and search for law and the word prophets, and you'll see that Jesus did use that as a way to refer to the Old Testament. And the reason being is that was the original Hebrew division in the Old Testament. They viewed it in 2 parts, the law and the prophets. Later on, there was a second form of division, and that was the law, something they referred to as the writings, and then the prophets. So this division started to take root when they started translating the Hebrew into different languages like Greek. So when the Hebrew people were Hellenized, when they were conquered by the Greeks, and this is way before the days of Christ, hundreds of years before that, most people, as they were growing up, were so immersed in Greek education, that's the way in which the Greeks controlled people they conquered, is they did away with their traditions and their educational system and replaced it with theirs. They started to have to translate the Hebrew into Greek, and when they did that, they took the Old Testament, which was pretty much complete by that point, so it was much larger than it had been at the very beginning, and they divided it into 3 parts: the law, the writings, and the prophets. The writings were the things that, say, David wrote or Solomon wrote, things that were more of a wisdom-type nature, designed to teach us wisdom, to give us understanding about life. They referred to that as the writings. So the law always remained the first 5 books of your Old Testament as you have them today: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That was always what they meant when they said the law. It's also referred to as the Pentateuch, which means the law. And so that is the first structure. The second was the prophets. Everybody after that was considered to be a prophet, given the word directly from God to be conveyed to the Hebrew people. So originally they lumped everything under the prophets. And then when they started to translate into other languages, they took the wisdom language and some of the historical writings like 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Samuel, which were their historical narratives, and they lumped those under the writings category. And then the prophets just became the prophets that were foretelling future events that hadn't yet taken place, like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Malachi, Amos, Nahum, on it goes. There were a lot of prophets in the Old Testament, and that included those. Our modern day Old Testament follows really a four-way division. So this is what we'll be most familiar with, and you'll see this in the way in which your Old Testament is assembled together. So the way our Old Testament is assembled, we have the same books that the Hebrew Old Testament had, but we put them in different order, and this is the way we order them. The law, the first 5 books Genesis through Deuteronomy, what we refer to as history. So this includes like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And you understand why we refer to those as history books, right? They are recording the history of the Hebrew people. They are recording the history of Israel. And so we put all those in one category. And by the way, that also includes books like Ezra, Esther, Ruth, Nehemiah. They're considered historical narratives. And so we put them in the category of history. Poetry is the third division. And poetry starts with the Psalms, and it runs through Ecclesiastes. So you have Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. Those are referenced as poetry. And that's a very fitting way to put it because most of those books were written in the Hebrew form of poetry. So that's why we put them under that designation. And then the prophets start after Ecclesiastes, run all the way to Malachi. So that's the way your Old Testament is structured. Now, their Old Testament was structured a little differently, and that structure changed over time as more inspired writings were added into it. But ours follows this basic division. We have the law, we have the history books, the poetry books, and then the prophets. And that is pretty easy for us to follow. Where it does get confusing and where it creates a little bit of a problem if you're trying to do a survey is it's not following a linear timeline. So even the history books don't necessarily follow a linear timeline. It's not like you read 1st and 2nd Samuel and then you jump to the next historical book and it's taking up that same period of time that the one ended, the next one starts. No, they overlap. So you're going to find the history of David in multiple historical narratives like Kings and Chronicles. You're going to find him in both. And what the survey does, it helps us to put all of that together and basically divide it out. So that sounds complicated. It won't be that complicated, I promise you, when we get into it. But what we'll do is we'll help you follow the life of David through Kings and also through Chronicles. So you'll see both narratives of his life. It's kind of like the Gospels. You know how the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they follow the life of Jesus. Each one does it independently, but when you layer them together, you get a better understanding of the life of Jesus. Same thing with the history books. We're going to overlap those histories. And a lot of people don't realize, like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther overlap within those hysterical. It's going to be a long night. Because, if that's where I'm going, it's going to be a really long night. It's the historical books. So they overlap into like 1st Kings, 2nd Kings, Chronicles, Samuel. All that overlaps into each other, and all of those fit somewhere in those historical narratives. And the prophetic books actually have a lot of historical information in them as well. So we will look at all that. We'll lay that timeline out. I'll kind of show you how those divisions work, and you'll be much better able in the future then to kind of understand how to look for certain things, and you'll have a better understanding of where they are. Because we're going to really cover the major events and the major people and put them in their individual context as we work our way through. So again, these are the books, these are the divisions. This is the division we're going to work with. We may reference the Old Hebrew division, some as well, but probably not a lot because it gets confusing. We're going to stick with the way in which it's structured in our Old Testaments, and then we'll talk about how the different things overlap. So the law is really easy to follow. It begins with the book of Genesis, and we're going to talk about Genesis quite a bit tonight. And we're going to do it sort of in the big picture overview, if you will. Not really looking at a lot of passages, but we are going to look at some. The word Genesis is actually a Greek word. If you didn't know that, it is a Greek word, and it means in the beginning. That's what the Greek word means. It means the beginning. So that's where Genesis comes from. It comes out of the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament, and that's where we get that title for the first book of our Bible. The Hebrew title was comprised of two words that meant in the beginning. That's what the Hebrew title literally meant. So the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, the way in which it was originally composed, in the beginning is not just the first three words of verse 1, it is also the title of the book of Genesis. So they didn't have the word Genesis because it was Greek and it came later. They had the Hebrew words for in the beginning. So that's what Genesis actually means. It means in the beginning. That's pretty cool, isn't it? So the historical narrative, the goal in the historical narrative was to go right back to the very beginning. And Moses was then inspired to lay out for the Hebrew people where everybody came from. Everybody came from Adam and Eve, and that's what God explains to us in the beginning. So that's the foundation. In the beginning of our survey, we start all the way back at the beginning of the created universe. Not just the beginning of man, but the beginning of everything that exists in the material universe. The author is Moses. That's easy to find. You see a lot of references in the New Testament, but if you want a definitive source, there is no better definitive source than Jesus himself. In John 7:23, he says this, "If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath?" Sabbath laws come from Exodus. They also come from parts of Genesis, and they come from the Deuteronomic law as well in Deuteronomy. So what Jesus says basically is what you know as the law is actually the law of Moses, because he's the author. So Moses is the author of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And that's a great passage right there, by the way, because it encompasses all 5 books in some form or another. The laws about the Sabbath are found in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. The idea of making people whole and all that is found throughout all 5 books. So he's basically saying that what they knew as the law came from the pen of Moses. So we know that from Jesus. So the beginning of mankind, and you can follow along on your sheets now, and I gave you these because I really want you to hang on to these as we work our way through, because this truly is the foundation for any Old Testament survey. This first book of the Bible really lays out a lot of important information. So I'm giving you, again, a big picture overview. Genesis 1, verse 1, through chapter 2, verse 3, records for us the beginning. It records for us the creation of the world. So that's amazing. We have this great historical account of the creation of the world. And I'll even say a few more before we get into just going through all this. The reason that you have to have Genesis is the foundation for all of the history of the Old Testament as well. There is no Exodus, or at least the Exodus makes no sense without Genesis. He lays the groundwork for Israel and why Israel exists in the book of Genesis. And then you understand the Exodus better. You also won't really understand the law if you don't understand God's intent with Israel. And he explains that in the book of Genesis also. So in order to understand Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, you have to have a basic understanding of the structure and purpose of the book of Genesis. It also is the place where you do find the beginnings of the law, and then the law is unfolded through all 5 books. So you really don't have the foundation of the law itself without Genesis. So it's very important for us to understand that we were created. It's very important for us to have an idea of why Israel existed in the first place and where Israel came from. And that's what Genesis gives us. So it gives us the creation of the world. It also then shows us the place of man in the world. Beginning in verse 4 of chapter 2, running all the way down through verse 25, we see Adam's place in the world that God basically created for him. And that's what Genesis tells us, that God created the world for the people that he created in his image. We see the entry of sin starting in chapter 3, verse 1, and the result of that sin, which was the fall of humanity, and that covers down through chapter 4, verse 26. You also see the beginning of the covenant of grace, where God just doesn't kill Adam and Eve. Have you ever wondered about that, by the way? Adam and Eve were told that they could do whatever they wanted in the world God created for them, but they could not eat from one particular tree. And of course, you know that was the one tree they just had to eat from, right? And so they wind up eating from the tree they were told they could not eat from. That made them rebellious. They rebelled against God's authority. They rebelled. They broke his law. They became sinners in that moment when they rebelled and broke the law of God. Why didn't God just strike them dead? Because he said, if you eat from the tree, you'll surely die. Well, that's the beginning of grace. That's where we get grace shown to us for the first time. God showed Adam and Eve grace. He did not give them what they deserved, but instead he gave them what they did not deserve, which was life. So he allowed them to continue to live, and he did not give them the death until later on. They did eventually die, and that was the consequence of their rebellion, but he showed them grace. And so we get an understanding of mercy and grace even in these early chapters of Genesis. And that's going to be very important as we progress into other books in the Old Testament like Exodus. And as we do the survey, I want you to see grace and mercy existed in the Old Testament as well as the New. It's not like they were new concepts when you get to the New Testament. Genesis 4, 6 through 7, talking about the fall and the effects of the fall. We have a lot of verses that are very important, sort of like key verses that are often overlooked. Genesis 4, 6 through 7 is one of those passages that is often overlooked. God actually explains to us in great detail how sin nature works. And he does so in Genesis chapter 4, verse 6. When Cain's offering is rejected and Abel's is accepted, Cain gets exceptionally angry. And listen to this conversation between God and Cain. The Lord said to Cain, and yes, in those days, God did speak directly to humanity, individuals as well as groups. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry and why has your countenance fallen? So why are you angry and why are you upset? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? In other words, if you follow the laws that I've given you, if you follow the directions I've given you, won't your countenance actually be lifted up? In other words, won't you feel good about the outcome? And if you do not do well, listen to this, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you, but you must master it. And that's the problem, isn't it? Was Cain able to master the sinful desire that resided in his heart? No. In fact, he killed his brother. So in Genesis 4, 6 through 7, we also have the record of the first murder. So we have a lot of these major events tucked into these various passages throughout Genesis that help us to understand the condition that we're in. And again, the rest of the law doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't have the understanding that Genesis gives you. In other words, if you don't get this, if you don't get the reality that yes, we are wicked and we have been wicked since the fall, even wicked enough to take the life of our own brother over an offering being rejected and an offering being accepted, if you don't understand that, you're going to have a hard time understanding why God put so much detail into the Old Testament law. Why is there so much in there about murder and adultery and stealing? Well, because the reality is that's who we are. We are thieves and murderers and liars. And that is established in Genesis. So let's move on to that big picture again. You have what is called the Antediluvian races and patriarchs. This is the period of time between Adam to Noah. So when you hear the term antediluvian, it's referencing the time between Adam and Noah, the time between the beginning of life and the flood. So that's a designation you may hear. I'll try not to use words like that because it just gets confusing. But that's the time in which you have these races that lead up to the time of the patriarchs. But you have the first two patriarchs in Adam and Noah, and they are considered patriarchs in the history of Israel. The Lord said, Genesis 6:3, we have another verse talking about the depravity of man at the time of the flood. The Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Because of the level of depravity at the time of the flood, God limited lifespans to 120 years. Prior to that, if you study the chronologies of the first 5 chapters of Genesis, you'll find that people lived a whole lot longer. And so God began to shorten their years because it seemed the longer they lived, the more wicked they became. So a lot of these details are woven in, and you have to kind of grasp these, otherwise you won't understand the timelines. So before we get to Genesis chapter 6, people lived long lifespans, sometimes as much as 800 years. After we get to Genesis 6, because the longer these people lived, the more wicked they became, we have a shortening of lifespans to 120 years. It could be less, but he was not going to allow it to be more after that, because God realized that people just got more wicked as time went by. And so he was going to put an end to that as well. And that's going to affect and shape our survey as we go through it. All these verses I'm pointing out tonight will affect our survey as we go forward. So when we start the timelines in a couple weeks, you're going to see that there's some long lifespans up front. You're going to see some long lifespans, and this is where those lifespans get curtailed. Yes? Oh, yeah. So there's long periods of time there. The lifespans that we'll look at when we do the survey in Genesis chapters 1 through 5, like I said, it's 500, 700, 800 years. So when you're tracking time, you've got to take that into account. And then there's a break here, and that's why I wanted to point this verse out. There's a break here in Genesis 6:3, and the next group of people that are born, they're not going to live as long as some of the people that were already alive. So you're going to see these generations overlap, and some of these people that lived 800 years will actually live longer than the people that were their great-great-great-grandchildren whose timeline is going to be shortened to 120 years. So that's where a lot of confusion comes in when we survey. People are like, well, why is Methuselah living longer than his great-grandchildren? Because his great-grandchildren, because of the wickedness of men, God made a decree in Genesis 6 and said, I'm going to shorten the lifespans of man, basically those born from this day forward, and they're only going to live 120 years. So there really is confusing when you're looking, and I just wanted to make that clear. Is everybody clear on that? So you have people who are born that are going to live less than the people who are already alive, who are actually going to outlive them. We think that had to do with the way in which the aging process works. So God sped up the aging process as a punishment for depravity and sin. And it makes sense if you think about it. Because, I've studied this, and it's fascinating to me that even as they study like DNA and people at the genetic level, they really don't understand why we age. At some point, you actually get better and better, and then you stop getting better and you begin to die. And nobody really understands where's that switch at, because if they could figure out where that switch is, they would make sure it just stayed on. You just continued to thrive, right? But you don't. At some point, you begin to go downhill, and they don't even understand why. And it happens at a pretty young age. You peak out pretty early on. Well, if you didn't peak out till, say, you were 400 years old, you'd live another 400 years. You'd live 800 years. But if you peak out at 30 or 40, you're going to descend and you're going to die at 120. So that's what happens here. But it does affect our timelines. So we have to go by what the Bible says. It's not a misprint. It's not that they were measuring days separate. And by the way, the Genesis also tells us how time is measured. Time is measured by the rising and the setting of the sun, which is determined by the rotation of Earth's axis. Correct? The Earth is spinning at basically the same speed it was 6,000 years ago. It may slow down a little bit over time, but it's not slowed down enough to really affect time as we know it. So when we measure a 24-hour day, we're measuring time the same way they were. That's just the reality of it. So we're not talking about differences in calculation of time. We're not talking about differences in calculations of years. We're looking at roughly the same time frames. So when it says 800 years, we're looking at 800 years as we would know 800 years. So these times are basically the same. So we're going to go through this, and as we get through this, we're going to point out a lot of these key verses that help us. We don't just do a timeline based on our ideas. We do it based on what the Bible shows us. So we have these verses that tell us lifespans shorten. We recognize that. We factor that in as we move forward. So keep in mind that these first few things we're looking at up through the flood, you have people living long, long periods of time. Now, the sinfulness of the world is purged by the flood, and we see that in chapter 6 through chapter 9, where God talks about it in great detail, just how wicked the world was, his solution to basically remove that wickedness from the world and start over again through Noah. And we see that posterity of Noah and the early races of the Near East in chapters 10 through 11. So in chapters 10 through 11, we have Noah and the early races of the Near East. In chapter 10 in Genesis, I don't have a slide for this, I'll just give you some information. Chapter 10 is often referred to as the Table of Nations. When you survey, it's a big chapter in the Old Testament, because it tells us where a lot of the nations that we're going to be looking at throughout the Old Testament tells us where they came from. So we begin to get an idea of who they descended from. So we actually have some incredible history of which one of Noah's children became the forefather of various nations. And that's all found in chapter 10. Chapter 11, we then get the account of the Tower of Babel, which shows us where the confusion and division entered into the human race as a whole. And that then helps us to understand how the nations were scattered. So then we can begin, believe it or not, the Old Testament's incredibly, what's the term I'm looking for? It is very, very detailed as to who is who and where they went. So when you get through 10 and 11, you'll have a pretty good understanding of the division of the various nations and where they come from. And just in that short chapter, and then chapter 11, you get a pretty good idea of where they went as they scattered out. And then as the Old Testament progresses, especially as we work our way through the historical narratives, we can begin to build maps and understand where people were in relation to where Israel is. So God uses that as a way to give us a narrative of the early world. So we're looking at people groups and languages as sort of a dividing mark. But we do know then where all those different languages came from. They came from Babel, and whenever you find a language group, you know that's the group that migrated from Babel to that particular region. And you see a lot of those groups then listed in chapter 10 as to who they descended from. So we'll do the tracking through that. It's really, I think, pretty cool. I like stuff like this. To me, some people don't like it. I like it. It's tracking through, and all that information will help you understand the Old Testament better, too, by the way, because you get an idea of where the Assyrians came from. You get an idea of where the Philistines came from, and the Canaanites, who they descended from, and how that all interconnects. The fascinating thing is, like Ken Ham wrote a book years ago, talked about one blood. It doesn't matter what language you speak, what color your skin is, or where you came from in the world. We all came from Noah. We all have a common ancestor. If you want to go back further than that, we all came from Adam. But even closer to our day, we all came from Noah, because the only people that survived the flood was Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. So everybody came through Noah. So we have that common bond for all of us, and you'll see that in all those nations. Also, what I find fascinating about studying the Old Testament and surveying it as a way to study it, you'll also find out where even today, these modern day conflicts that exist, you're going to see that they existed thousands of years ago. That this war between certain people groups and Israel was going on thousands of years ago. Same people groups, same languages, same general areas, same descendants. And they understand that. They do. I had a friend at work. He was from Palestine, believe it or not, of all places. And he was an electrician. And great guy. I enjoyed working with him. A bunch of people there thought he was Jewish. That just cracked me up. They had no idea of world history. They all thought he was Jewish. I'm like, no, he's Palestinian. Well, ain't that a Jew? I'm like, no. It's not. But Rick was a great guy. I loved talking to him. I learned a lot. He knew about the feud. He knew where the feud came from. He could tell you about his people's history. He could. I mean, it was just fascinating to me. They understood these modern day conflicts are just results of past conflicts that have been around for a long period of time. And we'll be able to track through all of those as we work our way through. But Genesis lays the foundation for that. Because we see in Genesis 10:6, everybody's going to come from one of Noah's sons. This is a good example. The sons of Ham, and Ham was one of Noah's sons. He had 3 sons. They were Cush, Mizraim, and Put. And Canaan, actually 4, that are listed here. Canaan is the easiest one to recognize, right? Because what was one of the tribes called that Israel had to drive out of the promised land? Canaanites. They were descended from Ham's son Canaan. Now, some of the others you have to track down a little bit, but Cush, another tribe they had to face when they entered the promised land, were the Cushites. Who were they descended from? Ham. Now, Mizraim and Put, you have to kind of track a little further out because they become known under a different name later on, but you can still track it out because the genealogies are that complete. Another things we learn, and we do learn a lot of things about God, and that's the most important thing as we go through. Just in these early chapters of Genesis, we learn that God is sovereign. He's the righteous judge. He's full of grace and love, mercy and forgiveness. He's holy, which means he hates sin. He is transcendent and yet immanent at the same time. So God exists above all the people, but he's also immanent and involved in what's going on among them. We learn a lot about the condition of man. We learn the origin of sin, which explains why we are sinful. If left to our own devices, we spiral into depravity. We see that through the historical narratives, and it's still true today. And our sinful depravity leads to destruction and death. And all of this is recorded historically because it sets the stage for a man named Abraham. And so if you're going through and you're working your way through your Old Testament, and since we're taking 2 weeks off, I timed this out on purpose. We're not going to meet again for 2 weeks to study. I would like you to follow this timeline that I've given you and read these historical narratives. You got 2 weeks. That's a lot of time, right? Y'all snowed in. You know, you can't do a lot in the evenings. It's cold out there. Read through these historical narratives. And a lot of the things that I'm telling you, you're going to see as you read through it. So all this sets the stage for Abraham because God chooses to use this man. God chooses to use this man to reveal more about himself. So his creation is a revelation of who he is. But now he's going to start to reveal himself through a people. He's going to take a people for himself, and he's going to reveal himself through them. And that's God's plan, another way of revealing himself to his creation. And by the way, by the time Abraham comes along, a creation that by and large has rejected him. Not everyone, but the vast majority have. And so he's going to speak to them through this man and his life and through his descendants. So we see beginning in chapter 12 and running all the way through chapter 25, the life of Abraham. So first thing we look at in chapter 12 through 14 is Abram's call, his acceptance of the call, and the covenant of faith. So God makes a covenant with Abraham based on his faith. I'm going to read a passage out of chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So you have the basic parameters of what is called the Abrahamic Covenant. I did put that on your sheet, didn't I? Under Abraham, Genesis 12, 1 through 3. I didn't put it on there. I apologize. I should have put that on there. I think I was trying to save a little bit of space. So let me give you the parameters of the covenant. The covenant's on there. And the renewal and confirmation of the covenant is on there as well. So under A, let me back up real quick. Under A, you're going to want to put this down, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, because that's going to give you the basic parameters of the Abrahamic covenant. So you don't have to look through 3 whole chapters to find it. It's right there in the first 3 verses. This is the basic structure of the covenant that God made with Abraham. So the first thing he said to him is, you have to trust me and you have to believe in me. And the way in which you're going to trust me and believe in me is you're going to leave your land where you're comfortable, and you're going to go to a land that you're going to be a foreigner and a sojourner in, because I'm going to give that to you and your descendants. So that requires belief and trust. And everything in Abraham's life, by the way, required belief and trust. Everything from a son to carry forth the promise, who would be Isaac, to God calling him to sacrifice Isaac, and he's saying, "Oh, no, just making sure that you understood that you have to believe and trust me. I gave you that son for a purpose." So all that was there for his faith, to grow his faith, to stretch his faith. But he has to believe. That's his part of the covenant. He has to believe in God, and he has to trust God. And then God covenants to do this. I'm going to give you the land. I will make a great nation of your descendants. Your people will be a blessing to all the earth. I will protect and bless those who bless you, and I will curse any who curse you. And that's the basic parameters of the covenant. The renewal of the covenant is found then in Genesis 15:6, because he does the covenant renewal, so he gives them the covenant a second time. I'm just distilling it down. It's in chapter 15. Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. And that's where we see the connection between grace, faith, and righteousness. So basically, it's always been an issue of faith. Even in the Old Testament, it was about whether or not they believed in God and trusted him, or they didn't. Same thing today. We either believe in God and trust him, or we don't. Specifically, though, we have to believe in Jesus and his death on the cross, but that's believing in God and his plan for our salvation and trusting him. So same thing back then. And then we see this progression then out of this covenant agreement. We see the historical narrative in chapter 18 where Lot is delivered out of Sodom. Abraham and Abimelech in chapter 20. All these are big highlights of this narrative of this man's life. Of the birth and marriage of Isaac, the son of promise, in chapters 21 through 24. And then the descendants, which is the posterity of Abraham, in chapter 25, verses 1 through 18. And again, if you read through those, you're going to have a good foundation going forward. You're going to understand a lot of the names and people. Abraham and his direct children are very important. That's why the next subheading is Isaac, the life of Isaac and his family, chapter 25:19 through 26:35. And Isaac, of course, had 2 sons. They were twins named Esau and Jacob, and you find that in chapter 25, verses 19 through 28. You see the sale where Esau sold his birthright to Jacob because Esau was the firstborn. And he sells his birthright, his place of standing, to his younger brother Jacob, and we find that in chapter 25, verses 29 through 34. Isaac and Abimelech the second in chapter 26, 1 through 16. We include Abimelech because he's a king, and that helps us to follow timelines with narratives outside of the Bible as well that we can pull in. There's a dispute at Beersheba in chapter 26, 17 through 33 that's important. Esau's marriages are recorded then in verses 34 and 35 of chapter 26. The life of Jacob then is found starting in chapter 27, verse 1, runs down through chapter 37, 1. Jacob in his father's home from chapter 27, 1 through 46. Jacob's exile in chapter 28. Jacob was exiled, by the way, for his treachery in stealing his brother's birthright because his brother wanted to kill him, and so he had to flee to save his own life. Jacob with Laban in Syria, chapter 29, 1 through 33, 16. So that's his time in Syria working for Laban. Again, we already have a structured Syria at this point. As we would know it today, it was Assyria in those days. Jacob's return to the promised land in chapter 33, 16 through 35, 20. And his descendants, the descendants of Jacob and Esau, are listed in chapter 35, 21 through 37, 1. So we have a lot of genealogies tucked into the rest of the historical narrative of Genesis as well that we can track and follow who came from who. Because a lot of the nations that they'll face when they go into the promised land descended from Esau. So every time you see a split in the family, you're going to see multiple groups of people that come out of those splits. So Abraham wasn't just the father of one nation, he was the father of many nations. Because also we have descendants from Ishmael. Remember the son that he had that he shouldn't have had, but his wife got tired of waiting in her old age for God to bless her with a son. So she sent her handmaid into Abraham, and she had a child, and his name was Ishmael. Ishmael then becomes the father of a couple of different nations that still exist when the children of Israel returned from Egypt into the promised land. So you have nations that come from Esau, nations that come from Ishmael, nations that come from all three of Noah's sons, and then the nation of Israel itself that comes through Jacob. Pretty cool, huh? But as you survey, if you don't understand these backgrounds in Genesis, you're going to get really confused by these names. So if you spend the next couple weeks just going through these and follow the subheadings that I've given you. So lump up the subheadings, read the passages, write down any names that stand out, like important names that become tribes of different groups of people, and then you'll know where they come from in your Old Testament, that we have a historical narrative that tells us this is where these people descended from. You'll be surprised how many of the nations they had trouble with came from Ishmael and from Esau. For example, have you ever heard of the Edomites in the Old Testament? Do you know who the Edomites descended from? Esau. So Edom came from Esau. One of his sons, I believe, was named Edom, and he became the father then of the Edomites. When the children of Israel first get to the promised land, they get ready to enter in, they're having some difficulties, and God had told them, leave the Edomites alone. They live on their mountain, leave their mountain alone, don't mess with it. They didn't. When they were struggling, the Edomites saw an opportunity, and they descended from the mountain, took advantage of Israel's suffering, and basically looted their camp and killed many of their people, and then went back to their mountain. Then later, a misunderstood passage in the Old Testament that if you understand the structure of the Old Testament, you won't misunderstand. There is written in the prophetic books, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. Not a reference to Jacob and Esau, it's a reference to Israel and Edom. Because what happened after that was God allowed the Israelites to wipe out the Edomites. That's what that passage was about. So if you don't understand the Bible, the Old Testament as a survey, you're going to think, well, he's talking about Jacob and Esau. And a lot of people quote that. Calvinists, for example, will quote that and attach that to Jacob and Esau, the two individual people, when that's not who he's even talking about. He's talking about the Edomites in that passage, and he referenced them in connection to where they came from. They came from Esau, and Jacob was the forefather of Israel. So that's what that actually means. So then we have the descendants of Jacob and Esau, as I said. Moving on, then we see the life of Joseph, because guess, Jacob has how many sons? Do you remember? 12. Was it 12 or 13? I can never remember. I always get confused. He had 12 sons. 12 tribes. But Joseph's not included in the 12 tribes. No, he's not. Actually, his sons become two separate tribes, so it gets really confusing. But he had 12 sons. And we see the life of Joseph then starting in chapter 37 all the way to chapter 50. So Joseph's life is really chronicled in great detail because it's very important. Israel will take the life of Joseph and his brothers, and their national identity is so tied into these because the nation itself is divided into tribes, and each tribe is descended from one of the brothers. And they still track themselves that way. In fact, I'll tell you how serious this tracking is. If you go to the book of Revelations, the 144,000 is made up of 12,000 from what? Each tribe. Even in the future, God is keeping this same distinction all the way into the New Testament era. So even in the days of Jesus, they could tell you which tribe they came from. By the way, Jesus' physical birth, he was born to a woman, right? A real woman named Mary. What tribe was Jesus from? Judah. They still knew, right? So Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. That's why he's called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Guess what other famous king came from the tribe of Judah? Starts with a D and ends with a D. David. That was a pretty good giveaway, wasn't it? Started with D and ends with D. David was also out of the tribe of Judah. And a king from David's lineage would sit on the throne. That was the goal. And then to fulfill the prophecy that the final king would actually be a descendant of David, Jesus' mother had to be a descendant of David. Perfect, right? Fulfillment of prophecy. But you understand that if you do the survey and you kind of understand how the little pieces of the Old Testament fit together and how important each individual little detail is. So this life of Joseph is very important because a lot of the history moving forward is comprised of these various tribes that come from Joseph and his brothers. And it gets a little confusing as you get into this, so you really need to follow the names closely as we work our way through. So we have Joseph's boyhood from verse 2 through 36 of chapter 37. We have the story of Judah and Tamar in chapter 38, starting in verse 1. We have Joseph's promotion in Egypt as he gets into more and more positions of authority, found in chapter 39, verse 1, all the way through chapter 41, verse 57. We have Joseph and his brothers interacting in chapter 42, all the way through chapter 45, 15. Joseph's reception of his father Jacob into Egypt in 45:16 through 47:26. There's so many fascinating things in the Old Testament, too, as you read and you study through it. I got a challenge for you. If you actually, I'll put you to the test to find out if you actually read these various passages. How's that? I want you to tell me if you could find the passage where God tells someone way before Joseph that Israel's going to spend a certain period of time in slavery. Is that ringing any bells for anybody? Nope, not Daniel. It comes before. It was somebody who existed before Joseph. That's all the clue I'm going to give you. It was one of the patriarchs before Joseph, and God told him that Israel was going to spend a significant amount of time in Israel. I think he even puts a year time span on it. But you go find that and you bring that back next Sunday night. Don't you tell anybody else, because I don't want y'all to benefit from one person's hard work. You write it down on a piece of paper and you give it to me 2 weeks from tonight. How's that for a deal? Okay, here's how it goes. You're going to write down the answer on a piece of paper who God told that Israel would spend time in captivity prior to entering the promised land. It's in there. Or maybe I'm just sending you on a wild goose chase to get you to read it. I don't know. As long as you read the Bible, it works either way, right? No, it's actually in there, I think. Don't be telling anybody what it is or who it is. Make them look. Good for them. So see if you can find that. Joseph's reception of Jacob in Egypt then cemented the fact that all of Israel for that period of time had moved to Egypt and stayed in Egypt until we get to the Exodus. And again, that's where you connect into the importance of Genesis and connecting into Exodus. We find then in chapter 47 through 50, Jacob's last days and final prophecies before he dies. Joseph's assurance to his brothers of complete forgiveness is found in chapter 50. And then the end of Genesis flows perfectly into the book of Exodus. So I want you to see real quick before we stop tonight, I want you to see how Genesis ends and Exodus begins. So I put these on the same slide. Verse 26 in chapter 50 is the last verse in Genesis. It says, so Joseph died at the age of 110 years. Guess what that's less than? The new 120-year time life. The lifespan at 120 is maximum. Joseph dies at the age of 110. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. So the Egyptians had pretty good embalming techniques, so he's not going to be dust when it comes time for him to be taken to Israel, because he demands that his descendants don't leave him in Egypt. They take his body to the promised land when they go in. And then Exodus begins with these words. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household. So you notice how it ends. It ends with Joseph's death, and then it says, now these, connects back to Genesis narrative and tells us that everybody that's still in Egypt, when we get to the Exodus time period, is all a descendant from one of Joseph's brothers. And they all know exactly which brother they descended from. So the tribal affiliations within Israel go all the way back to these brothers who entered into Egypt and entered in as free men, but eventually became enslaved. And that then leads us into Exodus. So we have the foundation of the narrative. And this is the story of Israel, by the way. Once you get past the flood and we get into Abraham, that's the beginning of the history of Israel. And then you have to understand that portion of Genesis that describes the early days of Israel as a people in order to understand the Exodus account. And as I said, if you look for that verse that I told you to look for, it's just tucked away in there. It really is. It's like a little hidden nugget of treasure, and you just miss it. I missed it so many times reading it before. It's just kind of tucked in there. I don't know if you like treasure hunts or not. I do. As soon as I can buy Oak Island's new season, I'm going to buy it and watch it. So far, they haven't put it up for sale yet, but I'm going to get it. I don't think they're ever going to find anything. Don't care. I really don't. My wife says, you watch this every year. You've watched this for like 14 seasons or whatever, how many seasons I've watched now. She said, you've seen every episode. They ain't found hardly anything. I said, I don't care. It's the hunt, right? The hunt is as much fun as what you find. When you study the Bible, think of it like a hunt. But the thing that's different between that and this, you're going to find all kinds of great stuff in the Bible. You are. You're going to keep finding great stuff. But look at it like a hunt and have joy in the journey itself as well. Not just the end, but really enjoy reading what God has given you. He gave it to you for your benefit. So don't look at it as a drudgery. Look at it as a joy. If I can spark a sense of wonder in you, then I've accomplished my purpose so that you want to go into the Word of God and look for what God has for you. And hopefully you'll have a little bit of fun with it. I still get a little giddy. Is that a bad term? Makes me sound like a silly person. I get a little excited whenever I find something that I hadn't seen before. When I learn something new and I see something. So you see if you can't find something new. See if you can't find who God told that Israel would be in captivity before even the days of Joseph. So one of the patriarchs. That's the last clue I'm going to give you. All right? Let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you for another evening you blessed us with, another opportunity to open and study your word. Pray you would help us with this. This is a little bit out of the norm, and we know that. So help us to kind of see the importance of looking at the Old Testament as a whole, to kind of see the narrative that you lay out for us. And you do lay out a narrative for us. And help us to learn from that, because there's so much information in there about you and what you're like and who you are. There's also a lot in there about who we are and what we're like, and how we need you to deliver us from who we are and what we're like. And so I pray you would help us to see all those things, but also to understand these big events and to be able to connect all the different individuals, to kind of understand better where all the nations come from and all the languages come from, because that information's in there as well. So help us as we work our way through to kind of connect all the dots, put all the pieces together, so that we can better understand your word moving forward. And so we just pray you would give us wisdom and understanding in these areas. These are important areas, and so help us with that. It can be a little challenging, so we're going to need your help as always, but we believe you will. So we're asking you to help us to grow in wisdom and understanding. And above all, we just pray your will be in each one of our lives, that we would always be mindful to give you glory, honor, and praise, that you alone are worthy to receive. I pray you would watch over each one, keep them healthy, safe, in the center of your will until we gather again. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.